Hello everybody, welcome to this evening's screening of Plenty More Fish. Thank you so much for coming out on this gorgeous evening and making the time to be with us here online. This is the latest episode from Cornwall's Climate Stories. I'm Claire Wallerstein, I'm the producer of the series, and I'm here tonight with Brian E. Stokes, who's the director, and Ben Church, who's a local fisherman. He's actually the presenter of this film, and I think we might have found a new David Dimbleby. He might not be fishing for long. And we've also got Dawn Babe with us, who's one of the charity's trustees, and she's going to be doing a Q&A after the film. You'll see we also have several other people here on Zoom with us. These are some of our fantastic local fishermen and scientists who are going to be able to talk to us more after the film as well. So Plenty More Fish is a film which is all about Cornish fishing and how climate change is going to affect it. As we all know, fishing is a huge part of Cornwall's identity and heritage. Fishermen do a really hard job, and climate change might not be something that you might automatically think of as being a concern for them. But a big part of what we're trying to do in this series is to talk and listen to people who might not usually have been part of the climate conversation and hear what they've got to say. Some of the biggest changes that are happening in our planet are actually happening in the ocean. They're going on out of sight below the surface. And as one of the scientists that you're going to see in the film told us, actually fishing vessels around Cornwall are more like research vessels, because the kind of things that they're bringing up are telling scientists so much about what the changes that are happening in the sea. Fishermen are on the front line. They're out on the sea every day, and they know a lot more actually about what's changing in the oceans than we might do in our offices or in cities. So what we're going to do now is play the film, and then afterwards we're going to have a question and answer session. So if you have any thoughts or questions throughout the film, please do put them in the chat box that you should see on the YouTube live stream where you're watching. And Dawn is going to go through these and put them to our panellists once the film is over. I should also mention that you'll notice the credits of the film are quite long. This is because we've actually put in the names of over 260 people, fantastic supporters who actually donated to a crowdfunder that we did quite recently, which enabled us to raise over £23,000 to help go towards production of the next films in this series. And we just wanted to say a huge thank you again to everybody who supported us with that. And now, without further ado, let's listen to the climate stories our local fishermen are going to tell us, and find out what we as consumers and what fishermen as well can do to try and help reduce the carbon footprint of the fish that we eat here in Cornwall. Really hope you'll enjoy the film.
A timeless Cornish scene. Fishing boats returning to the harbour to unload their catch after a day at sea. It may look like nothing's changed, but what's coming up in the nets tells a different story. My name's Ben Church, and this is my climate story. I've loved fishing ever since I was a child, and today I own a small commercial fishing boat called the Jasmine Rose, and I fish for bass, mackerel and pollock with rod and line near my home in southeast Cornwall. I love being out on the water with that sense of freedom and changing conditions, and now my daughters are hooked too. Fishing has never been easy, and it's still one of the most difficult and dangerous jobs out there. But now there's another concern: climate change, and I've been more and more concerned about what effect that's going to have for fishing here in Cornwall.
There's jobs that people have been doing here for 30 or 40 years that have sort of ceased to exist because the fish that they're targeting have just vanished relatively rapidly. In just a few years, things can change quite a lot.
I won't be the last fisherman. I won't be the last fisherman.
Yeah, you never know what we've got on the horizon, really. We didn't expect this.
If there's one thing I know about Cornish fishermen, it's how adaptable we are. We have to be, dealing with fluctuating markets, unpredictable weather and fish quotas. Against all of these, climate change seems like a far-off problem. But I'm not the only one to have started seeing changes.
Every day I go to sea, I take a surface temperature reading. It's given to me on my depth readings. We're seeing the last 2 years probably a degree difference at least, if not more. 10 years ago you wouldn't see a spider crab this time of year, but what we're seeing now with a slightly warmer water, they're coming in more and more and more. Yes, some people say that it's cold at the moment, just under 10 degrees, 9.8 to 9.9 degrees at the minute. But if you went back, I'd say 10 years, you'd probably still be at like 8 degrees now. Proper winter temperatures.
And we're noticing different types of fish here that we never used to catch. A lot of like Mediterranean octopus, and seems to be more bream and more red mullet, which is sort of Mediterranean species. And the sort of traditional fish like the cod and the haddock and the whiting and that, they seem to be going more and more north. We've started catching these barrel jellyfish by the ton. To see that many jellyfish, something's changing, definitely, you know. We're the first people that would see it because we're actually in it every day. We're on the sea, and you would have to be there to see what's coming up to say there's something wrong here.
Marine biologists have been studying the science behind the changes we're seeing. Steve Simpson is one of them.
Fish are cold-blooded, so they need to live in the places where they're best adapted. So as the water's warm, then that really means that the right place for a species has moved further northwards. Fish on the move due to climate change is never good news. The story for the UK is probably not all bad news in that there are lots of fish species moving into UK waters. But for the fish that are moving further northward, so things like the Atlantic cod, that's now getting really squeezed up to the North Pole. There's nowhere that's going to be colder that fish species can go to. If we look down to the tropics, the fish species are now experiencing waters that are really too warm for them. So we really worry about tropical fish and the many of the world's poorest nations that depend on the fish for their protein in the diet. Temperature obviously does affect fish directly, but it also affects them indirectly. For fish that depend, particularly in the very first few days or weeks of their life, on there being an abundance of prey in the water, they swim around feeding on plankton, that's had really profound effects. We've seen evidence now of plankton distribution shifting by over 1,000 kilometres further north.
These big changes have brought one of the ocean's top predators into Cornish waters. Sometimes called the Ferrari of the ocean, the bluefin tuna can swim at up to 80 miles per hour. The first time I saw one a few years back, it blew my mind. But now we're seeing them more and more often.
There's something definitely happening. There must be, to have fish like that up here. Of course, we're not allowed to catch them because there's no record of us ever catching them. A fish is worth like £4,000, so you wouldn't have to catch many fish to give you a wage kind of thing for a year, you know?
And this could be one of the problems as the species in our waters change. A complicated quota system regulates what we are allowed to catch, and it's based on the records of what was caught here in the past.
It is a big problem. If you base quotas around a track record of what you've caught in the past and something new comes on the ground, where does the quota come from? And the Scots saw it particularly over the last 10 years with hake. Historically, they never caught any hake in Scotland. They're catching a lot of hake now and no quota to retain it. We're very lucky. Down in Cornwall, we catch up to 60% non-quota species, the likes of red mullet, cuttlefish, squid, all non-quota species. So the fishermen can catch as much as they like. And one of the reasons they're non-quota is because we haven't got the science behind actually what does a stock look like. You need to know much more about the different species, and until we've got that science, it's very, very difficult to manage. It's not rocket science, it's fishery science, and fishery science a little bit more difficult.
Cornwall's waters are already the most diverse in the whole of Europe, with fishermen catching up to 70 different species. But you need different types of gear to catch different types of fish, and that's expensive and risky.
Things are changing daily, let alone yearly, and that's the issue, is it's finding the money to adapt. You can't have every sort of fishing gear. One string of nets, fish for red mullet, you're looking at around about £700. To do it properly, you'd need 3 or 4 sets of that gear. So there's, £2,800 near enough straight away, and they nearly have to be replaced once every 2 years. So that's a constant battle all the time.
Some of the fishermen have invested in different types of nets and so forth to target different fish in anticipation of what's changing and moving away from things that are failing. But it's hard to really anticipate what's going to happen in several years' time.
I often land my catch in Plymouth, and getting there takes me past this tiny hut. It doesn't look like much, but it's actually full of equipment helping scientists to find out what's driving the changes in the sea and what might happen in the future.
There's a few sites in the UK that make observations in the atmosphere and in the ocean, but we're very uniquely placed here to be able to look at both the ocean and the atmosphere at the same time. The current estimates are that the ocean has actually absorbed about 90% of the excess heat that's been generated due to increasing carbon dioxide emissions. When the climate warms, we expect to have a windier planet.
The same way that if you warm a pan of milk, you see eddies starting to form, you see the surface of the milk start to get more violent. We're doing the same with the world's oceans.
Every time fishermen are going to sea, they're already having to make a decision between how much physical risk they're willing to face at sea versus the kind of financial risk of staying ashore and not earning a living. So with increased storminess, whether that's more frequent storms or more severe storms, that's posing a greater physical risk for fishermen going to sea. Even a moderate increase in bad weather could really affect small boats, and that comprises about 80% of the registered fleet in Cornwall actually. Some fishing gear is much more dangerous to operate under certain conditions. So for example, lobster potting, if you're hauling heavy equipment on a boat, that's very difficult to do in rough seas. Similarly, something like ring netting, which is hauling a very large weighted net over one side of a boat, is a really dangerous thing to do in bad weather.
Last winter we had just storm after storm, and a lot of the boats hardly went to sea for 2 or 3 months. If the weather is getting worse, the big boats can still go to sea and the modern boats can still go to sea, but the older boats and the smaller boats tend to be kept in. So you get quite a divided fishing industry where the big players are still very successful because the prices are high because most of the fleet is in, and the majority of the boats are stuck in worrying about their livelihoods. So it does have quite a big impact on some people in the fishing industry. A lot of people, really. Also, the boats are probably more capable than they used to be. So weather that might have stopped a boat 30 or 40 years ago, maybe now the boat is a bit more better designed and can put up with that weather. That doesn't mean it's any more comfortable for the fishermen, though.
More than half of what's caught in Cornwall isn't actually fish at all, but crustaceans and shellfish. Like a lot of Padstow fishermen, Johnny Mert specialises in crab and lobster, and he sells his catch to the town's famous restaurants. In summer, the tourists expect a constant supply, whatever the weather.
When historically it would have been really settled, and you get a really good time right through the summer to certainly get in around the shore, we're a lot more wary now. If we get these big storms brewing in the mid-Atlantic, we get heavy swell, so we've got to get all of our gear out of the shore. And it was never the case, 20 years ago. We do a lot to the restaurants, so it's tough when you can't get out and they're all crying out. So, and then you do get a day at sea, and then they're all getting moody with you because you've landed it in one restaurant and not to them.
Malcolm Baker has been fishing all of his life and is one of the few Cornish fishermen who still knows how to make crab pots the traditional way from willow. These were fine when people just put out a dozen or so pots, but nowadays a fisherman might use hundreds or even thousands of much heavier ones hauled up with a winch.
Yeah, I know a chap down in Casworth. He still makes them. And I think there's someone in Devon as well. This year breaks, obviously, so any crabs after a while just chew through that. I just use iron ones now. Those there, but with the winch you got now, they just pull most of the pieces, or they pull the inside out. There'll be nothing left of them. Yeah, what they used to do is put 3 bricks in them to kill them down, and then they would get waterlogged, but they would still be off it. They'd be still going after a gale of wind. Whereas these sort of things, they're heavier, obviously.
But our more unpredictable weather means even this heavier, tougher gear is more likely to break loose too. Lost nets and pots are hard to recover and become what's known as ghost gear, which can carry on catching and killing sea animals for decades or even longer.
The wind that we have now, I mean, it is gales and gales, proper storms, isn't they? And I don't think we used to get so many as that. You get a gale of wind, but now they're talking about 11s, 10s and 11s, isn't they? Storm force. They never used to have it like that. The trouble is, if these tier pots get lost and they got bait in them, they'll be fishing. They'll be still fishing, and they can't get out. So if it gets cut off or breaks through a storm, people must lose an awful lot. If they're right in tight to the shore, they must do. I don't know what the answer is really. Go back to these. Go back to them.
But it's not just stormier weather we need to worry about. It turns out the increasing carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is starting to make the sea more acidic too. The worry is that this could start to dissolve the shells of animals like lobsters, which are a big business in Cornwall. Almost 500,000 of them are caught each year, and Carly Daniels helps to breed and release tens of thousands of baby ones to boost the local stocks.
Acidification can actually affect the bioavailability of mineral ions in the water, so the calciums and magnesiums that they need in the shell of the lobster itself. That can affect how quick it takes them to harden and therefore how quickly they can protect themselves, because the shell is what protects them from predators. But also there's disease issues. And so rising temperatures might be more beneficial to bacterial shell diseases. It's going to degrade the shell of the animal. It's detrimental to the animal, but also detrimental to the fishery as well, because your product isn't as high quality as it would have been before. They also have a benefit to the ecosystem themselves. So they're what we call keystone species. They eat the sea urchins, the starfish, which then allows the kelp to grow. So they do have a bigger role to play in the marine ecosystem than just supporting human populations around Cornwall. They're supporting the marine environment as well.
Another shelled creature, the native oyster, is caught on the River Fowl in what must be the world's most climate-friendly way of fishing. Laws from the 1800s mean the boats can't use engines to fish, and it's just so impressive to see the oystermen working the traditional vessels using the wind and tide. But even here, the oysters which once grew in huge reefs are in trouble.
100 years ago, 200 boats landed 800 tonnes. Now there's 10 boats landing 10 tonnes. Yeah, that is a massive difference. 85% of the world's population of European flat oyster and 95% of the UK's populations have gone, whether that's overfishing, disease, pollution or invasive species. The native oyster is really seen as the northern hemisphere coral reef. If there was this kind of decimation of the coral reef in the southern hemisphere, there'd be absolute uproar. They filter 50 gallons of water a day, each oyster. They create clean water, so the sunlight reaches the seabed, which helps the marine plant life. Without the clean water, the photosynthesis wouldn't happen, the plant life wouldn't grow, and therefore all the other species wouldn't hide in that plant life. What I'm doing with the hatchery and the aquaculture site is trying to repopulate this fishery before it collapses. It's the habitat and the planet that are going to benefit. There's some big problems in the world that we can hopefully start to tackle. We can't change the whole thing, but we can start to ease the pressure. Native oysters are notoriously hard to successfully hatch. You have to have the right temperatures, the right salinities, the right pH level, acidity. But we're going to try and do 4 trials this year. Eventually we can create millions of larvae. Maybe in 10 years' time we might see a big difference, but it is going to be 3 to 5 years before we're going to have anything that we might create this year making a big effect on the bigger picture.
Rebuilding the oyster beds could help to fight climate change because oysters take in carbon dioxide to help build their calcium carbonate shells. Chris wants polluting companies to support the oyster recovery as a way of offsetting their greenhouse gas emissions, and he's already got a local concrete company interested.
Their industry is quite a heavy footprint. Cement is lime that's kiln fired and dried, so it's the process of drying the lime which is the big impact. So he's very keen to kind of see if we can work together on balancing out or trying to reduce his footprint. It's just mitigating and offsetting that impact, I think. So we can carry on making concrete products, but we need to put more into natural oyster fisheries in order to balance that.
Native oysters live deep underwater, but I've been noticing another type of oyster much higher up on our shores over the past few years. Pacific oysters, which grow bigger and faster than our native species, were introduced in the 1950s for oyster farms. They weren't supposed to be able to reproduce because Cornwall's waters were too cold, but that's all changed now.
That is amazing. 53 oysters just in one quadrat, and that's probably the highest density that you see anywhere in Cornwall. These reefs just weren't here a few years ago. All around Cornwall we've been finding areas where there are previously no oysters and now got large populations.
But all oysters do a good job of filtering the water and locking carbon away in their shells. So does it really matter whether they're native oysters or invasive Pacific ones?
Mudflats are really important features of our estuaries. They are a carbon storage area, which is very helpful, but also they're rich in life. So if you were to actually dig out a cubic metre of the mud, you'd find huge numbers of little clams and little worms and creatures in there. And if you actually were to add up all the calorific value of all those, it's roughly the equivalent of 30 Mars bars. So it's highly productive. It's really important to wading birds, to fish that will feed on worms. You know, you look at them and you think, oh, there's a load of mud there, what good is that? But actually, it's providing us an ecosystem service, and what we don't want to see is that being lost by being smothered by this non-native species. They're very sharp, and there's been lots of people who've been cut by these. In an area like this, we rely on tourism. If we're losing sandy beaches, that's potentially going to have an impact as well.
But there are uses for these aliens.
Each oyster has got protein inside and a shell made of calcium carbonate, and both protein and calcium are commodities that have a value. You can actually make an alternative to cement by heat treating the crushed shells. The protein can be removed and processed potentially, could be dried, could be turned into protein powder, and there's an international demand for that. At this current rate of growth, we're going to have a supply of Pacific oysters for a very long time, so we really need to try and get on top of it.
One man has already started. Ewan Abram Moore is a landscape gardener and is grinding the shells up into something he believes could massively benefit Cornwall's acidic soils.
It's so satisfying when you hear it going there. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It'll crush granite quite easily. These Pacific oysters are great because they're big and heavy. You look at the sizes, they're only about 4 or 5 years old. You know, I've learnt so much. I've learned a bit more about soil bacteria, soil structure, how important calcium is to plants, how good pH in soil can allow plants to access nutrients that they wouldn't normally be able to. You'd need to give them artificially. All my fruit bushes have the shelly grit sprinkled around them. Vegetable beds, when you're preparing vegetable beds, lightly sprinkled every time you plant the bed makes a good vegetable. Ditto the flowers. So after they've been crushed, I grade them because I do use some of this for chicken grit. It's quite a coarse mix, it's a 15 mil to dust. Love your soil. It's a fabulous resource, doesn't need any more chemicals than crushed shell.
One of the things I love about catching my own fish for food from the sea is compared to farming for meat on the land, it's really low impact. If you're fishing, you don't harm the soil, you're not cutting down trees, you're not using fertilisers, pesticides or irrigation. But I've started to wonder if the fishing industry has too much of a carbon footprint itself. I don't burn a lot of fuel in my boat, but a big trawler can get through 2,000 litres of diesel a day. That's like filling up an average car 40 times.
A mobile gear boat that's towing a trawl along the seabed will use in a day what a static gear boat, so a lobster pot boat or a gill net boat, uses in a week. But, you know, they're the ones that are catching the volumes of fish. So if you equate it to per kilos, it's not as impactful as you might think. But they've got a vested interest in reducing fuel consumption because it's their biggest overhead. We can see the price of fuel going only one way, and that's upwards. So we do quite a lot of work with guys to try and reduce the drag. So, you know, by using compacted twine. So if you remove net from the trawl itself, you can make it easier to tow through the water, hence you'll use less fuel.
The government wants all new commercial boats to be zero carbon capable by 2025. I can't really imagine Cornwall's fishing fleet powered by anything except diesel. Is it even possible?
Norway have got their first fully electric commercial vessel, but we've got a lot of work to do. It is difficult because to change an engine in a boat is a lot more difficult than actually changing an engine in a car. The larger the boat, the higher carbon footprint that it's got. So it will be those that would be the ones that you want to address first, but there's no charging points 100 miles off. You'd have to have massive storage capacity to keep a vessel going for 7 to 10 days. So it's the offshore guys that will really struggle until technology catches up. And I'm sure it will do. What that will look like in 20 years' time, God only knows, but it'd be interesting to find out.
I think becoming carbon neutral for a fishing boat would be a real advantage. It would be good for the environment and it would be good for marketing as well. But if I replace my engine with what I've got, I could do it for £20,000. If I want to go full electric, it would be £85,000. And I'd be restricted to about a 6-hour day at sea just because of the battery banks that are required and the extra weight, so you've got to push that extra weight around, and so I don't think that full electric is quite there for the fishing industry at the moment, but hopefully, you know, not long into the future we'll get there.
Hydrogen is an interesting thing. Hybrid vessels, the ones that have got hydrogen units fitted to boats, I think that is something that could possibly come on within the next 5 years. Trying new technology alongside your rugged diesel engine I think is the way forward. You can go a lot of way to reducing emissions of diesel engines by adding technology to it, and hydrogen generation is one of those, I think.
It's not just how fishermen get around that has a carbon footprint though. Like pretty much everything else these days, Cornwall's fishery is part of a complicated global supply chain.
What I find really bizarre in this modern world is my crab pots are made in China, put on a container ship, sailed through the Suez Canal, brought here, and most of the crab pots used in Cornwall are probably in the same position. Then a Cornish fisherman puts them out to sea, catches some crab, and it's brought in, put on a lorry, driven to Heathrow, put in the cargo hold of a passenger plane and flown back to China. Quite a lot of seafood, like langoustines and smoked salmon and crab, all sorts of stuff is flown around the world in passenger planes, in the cargo holds. But in this world of global warming, is that really sensible to be doing this?
And how our fish is actually caught can have a big environmental impact too. A recent study has suggested that by kicking up the seafloor sediment, which stores more carbon than anywhere else on Earth, bottom trawling could possibly contribute more to climate change than air travel.
It probably is a moment that we can just step back and think, hang on a minute, why are we catching fish in certain ways? Why are we sieving fish from the sea when there might be other ways that we can do that? Pots, hook and line might be better methods to be fishing than simply just trawling over the same ground time after time.
It's a really complicated picture. So if you love eating fish as much as I do, what can you actually do to help reduce the carbon footprint?
Our grandparents' generation would eat cod and chips because the cod were what the boats locally were bringing into port. That now is pretty much exclusively caught further north, Iceland, Norway, Russia. Those fish have moved, but our diet has stayed in one place. We still think that the great British fish dish is fish and chips, when actually what we're catching, what we're bringing into port now is this wonderful diversity of warmer water species that at the moment we're not eating.
We import 90% of the fish that we eat here in the UK and export 90% of the fish that we catch, which is pretty sad. The fish that we've got here is brilliant. What we need to be doing is buying fish caught in the UK, being adventurous and trying different recipes, buying it from local fishmongers and making the most of this wonderful resource we've got.
Now, changing the public diet is not an easy thing to do. We tend to be set in our ways. If we think about the mass-produced food, things like fish fingers, if we can encourage kids at schools to be eating fish that perhaps we historically haven't been eating as much, then generationally we're prepping our own nation to be eating locally into the future. When we look at the fish species that are on the increase, we realise that many of these could actually tolerate much higher levels of harvest. So they tend to be smaller bodied species, they tend to grow faster, they tend to reproduce younger. They lend themselves to a more sustainable harvest than possibly some of the big cold water species we used to fish for. But we could actually be producing more sustainably than we might have been able to do in the past.
It's a really mixed picture with climate change and the future of fishing in Cornwall. Yes, there will be impacts and changes, but now I'm feeling cautiously optimistic. The key is for us to fish in ways that will not make climate change worse. If we could eat what we catch right here instead of flying fish around the world, we can make Cornish fishing so much more sustainable. We are going to need really good science and management to make sure the new species arriving in our waters aren't overfished, and we'll need to restore and protect our marine habitats to help support them too. Fishing might be one of the most traditional activities in Cornwall, but it's going to have to adapt to the changing times and reduce its footprint, and that goes for all of us. That way there could still be enough fish in our Cornish seas for our kids to enjoy.
My best friend's dad says I belong in class. Skipping school's not normal. Lying on cold ground is not what I had planned. It's hardly school formal. The children of the revolution, we never knew normal. We were only just waiting for the bomb, 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 for the bomb. We never knew normal, only just waiting. What's that he said? Got my whole life ahead. Yeah, I'm feeling that. has the will to be kind. We're leaving men behind. Is this who we are? The children of the revolution. We never knew normal. We were only just waiting for the boom, 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 for the boom, boom, boom. We never knew normal. Only just waiting.
Hello, my name's Dawn and I'm a trustee of Cornwall Climate Care. I hope you enjoyed that film. It's pretty amazing, and it was also really amazing to see all those names at the end on the credits. Those are all the people who pledged on our crowdfund. So thank you once again, thank you so much for supporting the film and what we're trying to do. So that was really brilliant. So in a few seconds, we're going to open up to the Q&A. We've got some of the people you saw in the film and some of the team here sitting next to me. So we'd really love to hear your questions. If you are watching on the YouTube link, you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little chat box. So if you can stick some questions in, we'd really, really love to hear from you. That'd be amazing. But I'm going to ask a couple of questions first to sort of kick things off. So the different people here with us tonight, we've got Ben, who's hopefully you recognise Ben, who's our lovely presenter. Ben is a small-scale commercial fisherman who lives locally. We've got Bryony, our director, so you can ask Bryony a couple of questions. Obviously, we've had Claire, so Claire's here as the producer of the film. On a Zoom link, we've got some other of our experts. We've got Ruth Williams, who's the Marine Conservation Manager for Cornwall Wildlife Trust. Give us another wave. We've got Gus Caslake, who is the regional rep for the industry body Seafish. There's Gus. We've got Rachel Turner, who you saw, who's a lecturer in environmental social science at the University of Exeter. We've got Chris Ranger, who is the Saving Esther the Oyster, the river fowl oysterman. And we've also got Chris Blamey, all the way from Mevergissey. He's a fisherman. You also saw Chris talking. And you might also have spotted, if you're a bit of a celebrity lover, you might have spotted that Chris was also featured on the BBC's This Fishing Life. So we've got a celebrity fisherman here. So it's great. So to kick off, I'm going to start with a question for Bryony. Bryony, you are the director of the film and you've directed loads of amazing films, so really lucky to have you on board. Bryony, Ben was our presenter, and he's not a professional presenter. He's a kind of fisherman, normal guy. What were the challenges of presenting, of sort of putting a film together with just kind of a normal person in a film?
Without being rude. Okay. No, well, we all agreed before we started making the film that the most important part of this was telling real people stories. So you just have to work around it, really. And I actually think that it's easier sometimes because you don't have to pre-prepare. You're basically working with somebody who's just got to go with whatever you're going with. Each person's different, so you've got to kind of work out how to sort of get in with them in a very short amount of time. But often, usually there's less time. So usually we'll turn up and interview, like, you know, when we went down and met both the Chris's here on their boats. We haven't met them before, and you don't know in advance how to get them to relax or how to get them to talk about what they do in the best way. Whereas I had met Ben before, and I also knew from all of this that the best way of doing it was to get someone where they feel most relaxed. And obviously for Ben, it was going to be on his boat. You could literally see the colour of his eyes change as soon as he got out there. The love for what he does was there, and so therefore it's quite easy just to get them to talk about what they do. And, yeah. Okay. But yeah, it will. I'm sure it will get more and more complicated as we go along. We're going to have a different presenter for each film. Yeah. We've got the next one lined up. But yeah, who knows?
Great. Ben, so I have to say congratulations. You did a pretty good job.
Thank you.
Almost professional there.
Don't know about that.
So Ben, you're a sort of small-scale fisherman in the local area. I've had a chat with you while watching the film. You're obviously really knowledgeable about fishing. But during the course of the filming, what shocked or surprised you about what you learnt during the film?
I think the acidity levels, and it's worrying and it's fascinating at the same time. And also something that I see regularly is the oysters. I see it in Tamar. I see it on the rocks around us. It's it's very there. It's very happening, and it's happening now.
Wow, that's quite interesting. I'm going to turn to some of our Zoomers on the panel, and actually, just following on from what Chris has just said, I thought I might go to from what Ben just said. Just thought I might turn to Chris and just ask you a question. What we've heard through the film is really interesting. There's some kind of worrying and some interesting stuff, but we very rarely hear fishermen talk about what they're seeing out there. And why do you think that fishermen don't get this platform, don't have a voice? Why do you think that that's so unusual? Chris Blamey.
Which Chris?
Oh, Chris Blamey.
Yeah, I think fishermen, I don't think we like to, I think we're naturally optimistic people, otherwise we wouldn't necessarily be fishermen. And we talk amongst ourselves more freely, but we don't necessarily, we're kind of in quite close-knit communities. We don't necessarily talk to people outside of our community as much. So yeah, we aren't necessarily very good at sharing our views with other people,
Okay, and going to Chris Ranger now. Chris, Ben mentioned oysters, and what you do is absolutely amazing out there on the Fyle. I just wondered if you could perhaps give us a little update on what you're doing and perhaps some of the things that you're doing and seeing on the Fyle.
Yeah, hello. The screen's suddenly gone blank my end, but the native oyster is in huge decline, but we are seeing a huge increase in the Pacific oyster. I'm quite keen on harvesting, but they are irregular shape, and that makes it quite difficult for restaurants and hospitality industry to buy them. Matt came along to a little oyster bar I did a while ago before lockdown and thing. And I gave him a native and a Pacific oyster, and he ate both and kind of described them, and it was really good. So yeah, like lots of species, they're moving north. I think these Pacific oysters are also moving north and into different areas. It's a food. There is an abundance of it. It's not very pretty, maybe, but we got to stop eating with our eyes. This 9-year-old came to an oyster bar and said, "Can I have some free oysters?" And she said, "Can I have my sister's free oysters?" And it was like, "Why?" She said, "Well, she wouldn't eat them. She eats with her eyes." And that was like, yeah, you can have your sister's free oysters. There is abundance of some things and there's a decline in other things. I think that balancing what we might have had and what we've got a bit better will help us out.
Thank you. We've had interesting questions coming from Nathan Argent. Gus, you might be able to help with this. First of all, Nathan says, "Nice work on the film, guys. Great to have local voices speaking out on these issues. What role can your community, how can your community build pressure to drive forward national action on climate?" What would you sort of say to Nathan about that?
I think I agree totally with Chris. I think fishermen aren't very good at putting themselves forward. Chris lives in a community where they probably have the strongest fishermen's association anywhere in the whole of the UK. And if you have a problem there, I'm talking about Mevagissey. They've got good engagement with not only the managers of fisheries, but also in amongst themselves. It's a very nice place to fish from. And I think we could do with more associations similar to what they have in Mevagissey. You come down to Newlyn, we've got larger boats in Newlyn, but the industry is a little bit more diverse. You haven't got that group mentality, that group association where you can get voices around a table, and then you can escalate your your views, your dilemmas, your issues to a higher management level. And I think by building better associations within the fishing industry, I think that will help the voice of the industry to have a stronger sway when it comes to changing the management of fisheries.
Thanks, Gus. Kate Sugar's asked a good question. I might pitch this one to Ben, actually. She says, fab film, thank you, smiley face. I'd agree with Charmaine's question above. How do we link up local fisheries and fishermen with local customers to get more Cornish fish eaten locally? So how can we make it easy for people to buy local fish?
I think just an education. Whether that's going to come immediately, though, I don't know. I mean, my girls love fish. They love oysters. They love crab. But that's because so one doesn't like oysters historically. But that's because that's what they haven't had a choice at the end of the day. It's there in front of them because I like it. And I think if we can just showcase that, whether that's off the boat, and whether people can appreciate locally caught fish rather than farmed fish. I mean, I catch a lot of bass, and farmed bass is, it's frustrating seeing that in the supermarkets. I know it's a necessity perhaps, but if people could understand that that's not the best fish you can buy out there, and maybe if they could take it off the boat at the quayside or on the beaches, or speak to the fishermen.
Okay. We've had another quite interesting question come in. I think this one might be for Ruth. Ruth, you're the Marine Conservation Manager for the Cornwall Wildlife Trust. And Jocelyn KM says, if you had the Fisheries Minister DEFRA's ear, what couple of items would you ask them to prioritise first that they could realistically tackle in, say, the next 5 years? I mean, this could be a question for all of you, but I'm going to start with Ruth.
Okay, that's quite a biggie. The Fisheries Minister has got a lot to contend with, and in terms of legislation and the Fisheries Bill, there's a lot in there that we could make better in terms of striving towards the gold standard that we originally set out for. As a marine conservationist, I think one of the key things that I would like to see are more protected areas. And I think I need to get across that things like highly protected marine areas, they're seen as a conservation designation, but actually they're there not only to protect the habitats and species within that area, but they also protect the fisheries, the commercial fish stocks, the juveniles, the nursery areas, and the spawning stocks. And there is a big spillover from those areas. So I think having those small areas where habitats can recover and allow that marine wildlife to thrive and to grow will protect our sustainable fisheries in the long term. And I think it's getting, there's been quite a negative attitude from the fishing industry about highly protected marine areas and no-take zones over the historic past. And I totally understand that. There are short-term impacts that we really have to think about in detail, about displacement, and those sorts of things have to be thought about and compensated for. But we need to think about the short-term pain in terms of long-term gain. And these areas have been proven to benefit fisheries in the long run. We've seen it locally in terms of UK, in Lundy, in Lamlash Bay up in Scotland, in Lyme Bay regionally. And there's a new paper in Nature a couple of months ago that shows that for a 35% reduction in fishing area that was taken away for a marine protected area, over 6 years, there was a 225% increase in that fishery from spillover into that commercial fishery. So those long-term gains need to be really considered in the long-term picture of how we look at sustainable fisheries, so that they really can be win-wins for wildlife, but also for the fishing industry. And I think we need to get our mindset that sustainable fisheries isn't just about looking after our stocks and the quotas. It's about incorporating some of these conservation and benefits and sort of the looking at our seas holistically, I think is a real key. And that's one of the key things that I would like to put to him and to make sure we get off the ground rapidly.
Thanks, Ruth. That's really interesting. I'm now going to turn to actually Gus again, and we've got a question in from John Forward, who says that the question of quotas was really interesting. There's some quite interesting statistics there, wasn't there? And he's asking, how could the local quotas be revised quickly to suit the change in species in Cornish waters? So, Gus, I don't know whether you've got a view on that. Any ideas?
That's a tricky one. Fishery science is based around what's been caught, not what's being caught, and fishermen are obviously seeing things on the ground day to day. So, you know, there are methods in place for species such as spur dog that is it's an active role that fishermen play. If they see a lot of spur dog in a particular area, they report that to other fishermen, and fishermen can move away from the spur dog. For that, they're given a bycatch allowance, which allows them to catch and retain the spur dog that they're actually catching at the time, but they are volunteered to sort of move away from it. So that's an example of an active management role, but it is very, very difficult. As I said in the film, you know, someone once said to me that fishery science is a rocket science. It's more difficult than that because you actually don't know whether you've got it right or whether you've got it wrong till much further down the line. So it's a very difficult thing to do in real time. And the other thing we have in the southwest is, you know, 60% of our species is non-TAC, or non-quota. So the guys can catch as much as they like as long as it's over the minimum landing size. So there are methods that can be done, but it's a very difficult thing to organise and put in place.
Thanks, Gus. That's interesting. It does sound quite challenging. Rachel, I'd like to sort of turn to you. You're a lecturer in environmental social science at the University of Exeter. And there's a question in from Nat Dyer-Wild, and she said, there are a few mentions in the film of climate change tipping the odds in favour of larger vessels. Do you have any ideas on how policy might better support our important small-scale fisheries moving forward? So it's all about the impact on fishermen and how policy could potentially help.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, especially in Cornwall, where I think, you know, small scale, there's a real mixture of vessels, but small scale vessels are really important to so many small coastal communities. And it's not just about the fishery either, it's also about the community and the kind of social and cultural value of those fisheries. So I think some of the things that were spoken about in the film are really important in terms of trying to develop policies that can really support fishermen, like the fact that it is so difficult to anticipate some of these changes, and yet also the management around fisheries actually makes it quite difficult to be flexible as well, and there is also a cost attached to that. So I think we do need to think about policies that sort of enable some flexibility and provide some support to fishermen to adapt to the changes that are happening that might not be changes that they've had to deal with in the past. So that's one key area, I think.
Thanks. I'm going to pose one to Claire now. Claire, I think you know about this. So Pat Smith has just sent a message, and she said that fishing litter is a big component of ocean plastic pollution. Is any progress being made locally to reduce discarded nets, ropes and lines?
Oh, blimey. Well, yes. I mean, you know, we can't. It is a little bit the elephant in the room. In my previous incarnation, I ran a beach cleaning marine conservation group for 8 years, and it is true, certainly around Cornwall, a large proportion of what we pick up on our beaches is fishing related. But there is all sorts of stuff going on, actually. There's some really interesting research going on at Plymouth University in conjunction with a French university, I believe, looking at developing biodegradable gill net, which would obviously, you know, have a huge impact, hopefully, in terms of bycatch. I know Gus will know about this. There's another thing looking at trialling a different type of dolly rope. So dolly rope is kind of the big sort of orange hairy stuff that goes on the bottom of the trawl nets to try and minimise the amount of damage to the net as it goes along the seabed, and that actually can quite often come away and become marine litter as well. And I believe there's actually some trials going on looking at different materials to be used for that, or different ways in which it can be used to so that it will get lost less frequently. But I guess, you know, it is really the nature of the job. You know, fishermen are doing a really dangerous and difficult job in very unstable conditions. Often their decks are awash. It's impossible to eliminate all fishing related debris. And obviously, as our seas do become stormier, you know, that can become more and more of a problem, as we saw. But I think also, you know, a lot of fishermen are really doing a great job with Fishing for Litter and other schemes like that, with the Ocean Recovery Project and Odyssey's recycling of fishing waste into things like kayaks. There's a real sort of incentive now to bring waste back ashore for recycling, and lots of ports and harbours have signed up to that. And I think awareness is really growing, maybe, you know, as more younger fishermen are coming along. So I think attitudes are really changing. I've definitely in the past spoken to older fishermen who've said, oh yeah, you know, when I started back in the day, you know, we had to come back with a clean boat, anything just went over the side. But now that doesn't happen so much, you know, thankfully. And it's important for the fishermen as well, obviously, because you know, plastic in the sea is not great for fish. You know, we know that fish are consuming microplastics as well. Studies from Plymouth University showed that about a third of the fish looked at Plymouth fish market actually had consumed microplastics. And, you know, so there's obviously it's in fishermen's interest to minimise plastic waste as well. So I think things are definitely going in the right direction.
So talking about things going in the right direction, I'm going to turn to Chris Blamey down in Mevagissey. We've had a question in from Penzance Greenpeace, and they've asked, do you think fishermen would be interested to leave trawling and move towards more sustainable methods? And what do you think fishermen need to help that transition? So what do you think would make the difference for fishermen to sort of review their methods and techniques and move to different ways?
Yeah, I think people, there are definitely people moving out of trawling and mobile boats and diversifying into other things. If you've got a trawler or a boat that's set up for that, it's probably not going to be that suitable for what you're going to change over to. It's probably got the wrong engine. It's probably perhaps too big and things like that. They're gonna the people who are considering switching, they've got the wrong gear, they've got the wrong boat. It's going to cost a lot of money for them to change over. But there are definitely people who are interested in moving away from that kind of thing, but are kind of sort of pretty committed to what they're doing, so they can't easily move away from it. But I think there have been funding from the EU and from the UK government to help with this kind of thing, and I suspect that will carry on. So it's not all bad. There is already schemes in place, you know.
Thanks, Chris. Ruth, I'm going to turn to you again, actually. There's a question in from Scott Lewis, who's asked, do you think marine protected areas work? And should there be more marine protected areas, MPAs, around Cornwall? And if so, where?
Okay. First off, do they work? Yes, they do. There's evidence from locally, but also all around the world to show that they do work if they are effectively managed. So at the moment, we've got various marine protected areas in the UK. We've got the European designations, which locally we've got a special area of conservation. So we've got them in the Tamar and the Fowl and on the Camel. We've also got our UK designation, which is the Marine Conservation Zone. And I understand that all of these different acronyms and names are confusing, but they're just the different legislation in terms of how we get a marine protected area. So that's what we just need to think of these areas as. They're just nature reserves at sea, and they do work if they are effectively managed. And that doesn't necessarily mean banning all activity. You know, I mentioned earlier about the highly protected marine areas, and that's banning all destructive and extractive activity within that area, which is sort of the gold star level of a protected area. But generally, protected areas can allow certain activities if they don't impact what that area is designated to protect. So if it's trying to protect pink sea fans, then trawling would damage that. But netting, potting, hand lining, all sorts of other fishing activities could still be allowed to continue. So there's zoned approaches to getting an effective MPA. So yes, they do work. We've got a really good network of marine protected areas around UK, but sadly they're not all in that effective management. So we need to get better at that. So in Cornwall, within the Cornish inshore waters, so that's out to 12 nautical miles, we have 34% of that area as a marine protected area, which sounds great. That's what we're striving for, to get this 30%-ish designated. But only 7% of that of those MPAs are actually in effective management, so doing what they should be doing and protecting those species and habitats. And we need to make sure that management is far more effective for the same reasons as I mentioned before. We need to protect not only the wildlife within that site, but also the other ecosystem services that area can provide. And if we look after those small patches, those marine protected areas, the spillover and the benefits to the whole of the seas could be vast. So if we can get the ones that we've got in effective management, then I don't think we should need any more. But if we're not going to manage them effectively, then yeah, we need to seriously consider what they're there for. They can't just be paper parks, and we need to strive for that better protection and getting that zone. So some really highly, some less, and having a zoned approach for that bigger picture.
Thanks, Ruth. Tim Newcomb has just commented, don't forget us sport fishermen also see climate change. The top of the food chain is as important as the lower end. So that's quite interesting. And he's getting a lot of yes, I agrees in the chat. We've just got a few more minutes left. So time for a couple more questions. Bryony, there's one for you. So Lucas Cray says, Bryony, what was the most difficult bit of the filming for you?
What was the most difficult bit for filming? Seasickness. Well, despite living on a boat, I was probably feeling a bit queasy whilst going out filming a presenter. No, I probably found the hardest bit was obviously being weather bound. So I was basically out of tune with the fishermen. We only at first the weather was great, so nobody wanted to speak to us because they were busy. And then the weather got bad quite late on when we were panicking, and we did get some interviews with people, but a lot of them were kind of just turning up, hoping that they might have come in to chat. And then the fish didn't come in for a while when we wanted to get out and do some stuff with Ben. So, I was just living the life of a fisherman for a while. Or a fisher lady, obviously. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Bryony. So another question, I think, for Chris Ranger, actually. So Michael Paulston has just messaged in, and he said there was no mention of scallop dredging in the film. What is the view of the panellists on the growing campaign to ban such a destructive practice and move to only diver-caught scallops? So, Chris, do you want to try answering that question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of scallop dredging. I mean, big bars being dragged up and down the seabed. In our SAC, they're not allowed to scallop dredge. I mean, when we're dredging for oysters, it must be very clear that there's like a 1 meter frame, triangular frame, and we pull it in by hand. It has no teeth, and it's an area that's been fished for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not millennia. So we don't go into other areas. It's also a very silted up estuary seabed. So turning it over with a hoe, a bit like your garden, rather than going in there with a rotavator, is, a sympathetic and manageable, sustainable way of doing it. We do have a queen scallop on our fishery at the moment, and that is becoming quite a bycatch for us. There is a fear that going into an area with lots of queen scallops and not many native oysters might be affecting things in the future. But yeah, generally machine-powered dredging is not allowed in our SAC. We're allowed to carry on as we are because we're working under the wind and tides and sometimes an oar. But yeah, hope that answers the question.
Okay, so we've got another kind of interesting. Claire, did you want to say something?
I was just going to add as well. Yeah, we couldn't fit scallop dredging in there, but I guess that would come under the same sort of area as trawling in terms of the climate impact potentially because of the reanimation of the sediment and the possibility. I know there's a lot more research going on looking into how that carbon that's stored in the sediment when it's agitated like that, how that might affect the chemistry of the seawater and possibly even be released back into the atmosphere. But I did just want to say as well, we do talk about this bit on our website, so if anybody's interested, if you head on over to our website, there is a whole sort of what you can do section, and one of the big things on there as well is of course to check out the Cornwall Wildlife Trust Good Seafood Guide, which is just brilliant and has all sorts of information about sustainable fish choices locally, where and how you can buy Cornish fish from Cornish fishermen and some of the best people out there to buy it from.
Thank you, Claire. I had another quite interesting question in. I'm not sure who to aim this at, but I'll start with Claire and see how we go. So John Forward has said, are companies like Young's or Birdseye looking at promoting food which uses more of our local catch? Or how could we get them to do that? Any sort of insights? Seen anything like that?
Blimey, I have absolutely no idea. It would be great to find out though, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Are any of the panellists? Oh, hang on. Who's that? Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, it's not funded actually, but I've actually been part of a proposal that has been collaborating with Young's to try and do exactly that. So fingers crossed it might get funded, but some of those companies are interested in improving their sustainability credentials and supporting a viable fishery into the future, which is good news, I think.
Oh, that's interesting.
And Rachel, what could we do as the everyday folk to is there any way of putting pressure on companies like that?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, I think big companies like that do respond to consumer demand. So I think the more people that show that they want to eat local fish and sustainably caught fish, and the more we can communicate that to those companies, the more they're likely to engage in those kinds of issues.
And sort of linked to that, there's interesting question from David Starley, actually. I think this might be one for Gus. He said, would it help if the policymakers on fishing be taken on local fishing vessels to see the situation for themselves? So I guess what he's thinking about is there a sort of disconnect, if you like, between Whitehall and what's actually happening on the boats, and that might change their minds if they saw it for real. Gus, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think that it's been done in the past. We've had quite a few politicians over the years. I remember Paddy Ashdown, if anybody remembers him. He came and did 2 or 3 days on a beamer out of Penzance. It's just the time commitment. You see one thing from a day boat perspective, which is obviously the easiest boat to get out on that comes and goes on a daily basis, like Ben. But the larger vessels are going out for in excess of 5 days. Some of them are doing 10-day trips. So it's a big time commitment, and to actually do that, it's not easy to drop somebody off when you're steaming 100 miles before you shoot your net. So it's difficult, and that's where perhaps the industry could do a little bit better in sort of putting itself forward. I note Ruth's comments about highly protected marine areas. A lot of those areas were initially proposed by fishermen. Lundy is a prime example of that. So, there are things that the industry can do, and as Chris mentioned, we're not very good at putting ourselves forward. And if we could do that a little bit better, then perhaps we could persuade managers to manage the fisheries in a more sustainable manner.
Thanks, Chris. Did you have a sort of thought? I could see you waving your hand.
Yeah, I mean, I was just saying that you might not get the politicians out, but I think films like this one, this is The Fishing Life, Country File, and I managed to get on a Julia Bradbury programme. But I think, educating people from TV programmes is definitely are very good, and films and YouTube and everything else. I don't think you're going to get the policymakers on board, but I think by getting viewers to watch these, they become the decision makers who becomes the policymaker. And I think Ben, having kids that handle fish and eat fish, that's brilliant. I think that's the next generation. I don't think we can change the grandparents, but we can probably help the grandchildren is kind of part of the thing. So yeah, YouTube is a massive, easy, you can do it on your phone. Kids are on phones all the time and computers. I think educating that next generation is probably a better target audience than educating the policymakers at the moment.
Thank you, Chris. And it's funny you should mention YouTube, because one of the ladies in the audience has just said that she's loving the film, but she'd really like to be able to send a link for some of her friends to watch it. So Claire O'Brien, can you explain how people can show other people this film?
Absolutely. So this live stream that you're all watching in its entirety will be on this same link that you've used to come here tonight. So if you want to share the whole thing with them, you can just copy and paste that. But I'll also add to the chat box at the bottom the link. As of 8 o'clock, which we might be past now, the film on its own went live. So that will be on YouTube. I'll put the link in the chat box, and it will also be out there on social media, but it would also probably be, it's underneath our channel, Cornwall Climate Care's YouTube channel. It'll be as a standalone film for anybody to access. And there's lots of requests now coming in for live screenings, which is really exciting for us. Obviously, when the first film came out, we couldn't actually show it to people in halls. So we'll be going out and doing that. And Claire's been working really hard setting up educational resources to go alongside to get it into all of our secondary schools in Cornwall. So that is our exciting next big push, isn't it, really?
Yeah. And talking of exciting, Jocelyn's just asked, what is the next film in the series going to be? That's the last question, everyone. Time's up. So what is your next film?
Well, so this whole first year we're staying in the sea, so we are creeping up closer to the coast. The next film, which is coming out in the autumn, is going to be all about Cornwall's coastal communities, sea level rise, storms and coastal erosion, and how communities are facing up to what's coming and what they're doing about it. Next year we'll be emerging onto dry land. And there was a question in there, somebody was asking, there's been a couple of questions that I think we'll be looking at a bit more in the next film.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. So slight blackout there, just to end it ill. Anyway, thank you ever so much, all of you, for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. And like we said, if you like it, if you want to follow up, find out more, please do go to the climatecare.org website and check it out. All the links are there. You can share it with your friends. Please do share it with your friends, in particular young people. We're particularly passionate about that. Thank you very much to our panellists on Zoom. Thanks for all your interesting thoughts and contributions. And thank you to the team here, who are amazing. I hope you'll agree. See you very soon with the next exciting film. Thank you and good night.